about 500 years after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, already then some people were struggling to how to use Tisha B'Av, how to relate to the Churban, how to sit and cry all morning. And the great Paitanim, the great poets of the Jewish people, primarily Rav Elazar HaKalir, began to weave together and write these Kinnahs that we say. And it became the minhag, it became the custom of the Jewish people all over the world. As we know, we're meant to be in mourning the whole first half of Tisha B'Av. We're meant to actually be on the floor crying and connecting, focused completely. The minhag to say these, and obviously, here we're skipping because the principle that always when it comes to these things, better to do less with more kavanah, more understanding. The key is understanding. You don't have to say it in the Hebrew, you don't have to say the whole thing. You have to understand what's going on. We're skipping, we're going to go to Yud, to the 10th of these Kinnahs. And I want to show a little bit of what Rav Elazar HaKalir is doing, because people think it's just technical poetry of brilliance, but it's actually each time he does something poetic, he's conveying a very powerful emotional relationship with the Churban. Here you'll notice, especially if you're using an art scroll, that the first two words of every single paragraph, or first word, I shouldn't say first two words, the first word, the opening word, is parallel to an opening of each pasuk, each verse, from the first chapter of Eicha itself. So the first verse begins, Eicha Yashva Badad. How could it be that we're sitting alone? Yerushalayim is now lost and destroyed. So he will open with those two words. And so he does for each paragraph. But he turns it around. So he opens with the words of Eicha. And Eicha itself, as we read last night, and some also read in the day, Eicha is Yirmiyahu Navi's cry, Eicha, how could it be? Just this sense of shock at the impossibility. Things we thought could not possibly be. The house of Hashem is destroyed. Yerushalayim, the center of God's presence in the world, is left as a devastated ruin. The Jewish people, who are God's ambassadors in the world, are left as widows and orphans and crying and dying. This can be? And Eicha is a cry to ourselves, to Hashem, to everywhere. It's just a Yirmiyahu Navi's beautiful tragedy. And Rav Elazar HaKalir picks up on something he says in Eicha in the first chapter, only in the 8th verse. Chet chota Yerushalayim. It's a little line in there. Jerusalem sinned. That's why it became as it is. Of course, Yirmiyahu himself spent his whole life. He was a prophet during the reign of 5 kings, if you count the 1 month reigns. The last 5 kings. And his whole life, he was called to Hashem to try to warn the people of what would happen. And he was imprisoned for it. He went through suffering for it. But the biggest suffering he went through is seeing it all come to fruition. It actually really happened. And what Elazar HaKalir wants us to feel here is he wants us to put the two together. So for example, just take a look at the first one over here, Eicha Yashva. That's the line from the first verse of Eicha. How can it be that she sits? Chavatzelas Hasharon, and he picks the words Chavatzelas Hasharon. This is not from Eicha, this is now Rav Elazar HaKalir himself. This is another name for sometimes for Yerushalayim, sometimes for the Jewish people. The rose. The word Chavatzelas is actually a composite word playing on the fact that Hashem embraces us and yet we sit in his shadow. That's what the relationship was. Across the mountain over there, we were in the shadow of God himself. We felt the infinite love of God. There was a place on earth you could feel this. V'domam roin mipinoise aron. The blood, the silence, I should say. In this case, it's a play as well, but it's mainly the silence that's been done from those who would carry the ark. Just feel the pain of that contrast. Here we're talking about people who held the ark of Hashem's words. This was our heart. This is who we were. And now look at who we are. Then he says, he talks about the pain of loss of the Kohanim. And each paragraph ends with a word. In this first paragraph, it ends with Kenimsa Bais B'Msar V'Moran, when the house itself was given over to the rebels of Mourn. Who's Mourn? So every single one of these verses ends with a name for one of the 24 watches of the Kohanim. The priests who would serve in the Beis HaMikdash were divided, and each group had a name, and he puts at the end of each paragraph a name of those Kohanim. Why? Because he's saying it was our failure. He's throwing the mirror up to us. Look at this horrific tragedy. Eicha, how could it be? You know what the real Eicha is? How could we be that? How could we have come to the point where we're called the rebels of Hashem? We've been placed not in the hands of the Romans, not in the hands of the Babylonians, in the hands of the sinners of the Jewish people. Us. We destroyed the Mikdash. And then he makes this more explicit as he goes on. The second paragraph literally takes that second verse of Eicha, B'chai Tivka, cry. Who's supposed to cry? The Mechumeshes Sepharim. That means the people who were the guardians of the 5 books of Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Kinnah, Kohen, V'Navi, B'Yom HaKippurim. This refers to an episode where in the days of King Yehoshua, where Zechariah, the high priest, is trying to stop the people from putting Avodah Zoros. They brought idols to the Beis HaMikdash, and they're killing him. And this is what Elazar HaKalir wants us to feel. Last night we sat and said, B'chai Sivka Balayla, cry all night when you see the destruction of Yerushalayim. And now this morning we put the mirror up, cry all night at the people who could kill their Kohen Gadol, because they were so desperate to mix service with Hashem with an idol. And we cry at who we are. Cry at who we become. I'm not going to go through every paragraph, but this is what he does. If we turn over the page, if you're using an art scroll, it's 176. But look, if not, just look at the 5th paragraph. Hayu oyavim malivim, again, Hayu comes from Eicha. The enemies who are ridiculing us, for those who fought the battles of Torah. And what does he say? Because kavitlu aloi paris l'reiv lechem, the people who ignored, the people who on the one hand are fighting the battles of Torah, the religious Jews, the Jews who were doing what they needed to do, but they weren't caring about others. They ignored aloi paris l'reiv lechem. Some of them were rich and didn't care about the poor. Some of them were spiritually rich and didn't make their life responsibility caring for the spiritually poor. And they left people to be thirsty and hungry, physically and spiritually. And again, Beis Lechem is the name of one of those Kainic groups. And so he goes on, and he's saying we cry over the tragedy of what it means to have Yerushalayim full of orphans and widows and people begging for food, and the tragedy of what we read in Eicha of mothers who have nothing left to eat but the corpses of their own children, the unthinkable things, and yet the unthinkable way in which we hold that responsibility. If we just jump towards the end just to see where he goes, as he says in Kuf, Karasi litzuri v'koili la'arav, he says, I try to call out to God, but my voice is just, Hashem's not listening to my own prayers, my own tefillahs. In our disastrous moments, we cried out to Hashem, but there's nothing for Hashem to hear anymore. I cried in the forest in the west, the light that used to be the light of God's presence shining amongst us. The scent, the incense, we can do all the right things externally. But if we've abandoned God, He doesn't want our lights. He doesn't want our incense. It becomes a mockery. Then He rips it from us. And so we go to the final verse of the Kinnah, where he says, Tavoi samriach v'choshki tazriach. We turn always in the last thing and turn to Hashem from the darkest depths, because we don't know that we're any better ourselves. Who are we now? And the word Eicha, how could it be, has been turned right on us. Eicha, how could we be? Echoing the first thing Hashem says after the sin in Gan Eden, Ayeka, where are you? Who have you become? And we say to Hashem, Tavoisam riach v'choshki tazriach, which means soothe us, heal us, kadesh atzmoseinu, safriach, resurrect us like the grass that looks dead in the ground that comes back. Please, we don't know how to take ourselves off the ground. You give us back our life. Find within us, because all that we have, we can't answer Hashem. But all that we have is our tears. And from those, Hashem, turn our tears into life. And back to your table may we come. And the depth of tears that we realize we have nothing but our tears. That we have nothing, that the deepest thing we have to cry for is that all that we can do is cry.